Since January 20th, when a new Congress and White House came into power here in DC, the amount of spending commitments has already increased by 4.9 trillion according to the headlines, and that's on top of the enormous budget deficits already happening in the last 12 to 18 months, where it's increased with the pandemic as an additional excuse for even more big government spending and bailouts and quote unquote stimulus. Well, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says that those additional spending commitments, especially the infrastructure bill, are nowhere near enough. Recently, she said that there needs to be another 10 trillion in commitments over the next 10 years. The amount of spending is just going insane. Now, normally in Congress, this type of spending in the past could not be approved by Congress the way it is now with slight majorities. But the amount of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse from lobbyists and special interest groups, and the way that tons and tons, many, many billions, that add up to insane amounts. All these spending programs have absolutely nothing to do nowadays with the bills. These things are added in by lobbyists and people in Congress so their friends and family members can get board of director seats and payoffs and bribes. This is how corrupt the entire system is. It's actually very similar to the Roman Empire towards the very, very end, except it's in more modern times, but there's a ton of similarities. And so these additional spending programs are freaking nuts. And on top of that, you have on the right side of your screen, you have now Joe Biden and other Democrats in Congress. Senator Dick Durbin has been talking about this for a while now, but Joe Biden's pushing this even harder. $50,000 in student loan debt forgiveness. Now, this is going to create even more infighting and divisiveness among American families because there's going to be the haves and have-nots, the people who get the $50,000 if it does happen, the $50,000 in debt forgiveness versus the people who didn't get it. So this is going to create even more animosity, jealousy, fighting. This divide and conquer strategy, unfortunately, is how the people in power stay in power. So the DC elites, the economic and political elites, they'll keep stealing more for themselves. They'll keep funneling more and more wealth for themselves into unbidded government contracts and more DC real estate that they can continue to buy up. There's insane bidding wars here in DC on real estate. It's nuts. The stories are absolutely nuts about the bidding wars on DC real estate. All cash bids, dozens if not hundreds of all cash bids for properties, condos, houses that hit the market. It's insane. And this is exactly what happens towards the end. This type of spending should actually not be occurring because normally in the past, the way the Constitution was designed was the framers, the founders, made it very, very difficult for Congress to try to spend these insane amounts. And now over the decades, you've had lobbyists, you've had corrupt congressmen, corrupt senators, corrupt bureaucrats figure out ways around these with loopholes and backdoors and all this waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse that they stick into all these different bills and legislations. And it's just been adding up to the point now where government is so big and so bloated that they're talking now about trillions, and the majority of this currency is just going to be wasted. So if 10 trillion over the next 10 years is going to be created out of thin air and spent on infrastructure, there's going to be a lot of bridges to nowhere. There's going to be a lot of unbidded government contracts. There's going to be a lot of bribes. There's going to be a lot of waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. The infrastructure that America badly needs, and it really does badly need infrastructure. And we're the only major economy that doesn't have maglev trains or bullet trains. So we'll see if any of these infrastructure bills actually get passed. But unfortunately, there are ways around the normal congressional votes to pass legislation. And even if a bill passes that has absolutely nothing to do with any of the spending, they can stick spending programs into these bills. They attach them. There's just so much log rolling and pork. It's really, really insane. And that's why the DC metro area gets so rich and fat. And that's why real estate prices are so insanely high here. And if you want to learn a lot more about how big and how bad the corruption is here in DC at the federal government level. I suggest taking a look at the documentary The Best Government Money Can Buy by Francis McGahey. It was done a little over a decade ago, I believe. It's about $10, I think, on Amazon if you want to buy the DVD, and if you want to rent it, I think it's like $2 or $3. And he goes through a lot of the really ugly, painstaking details, including how large corporations and special interest groups, they get 100-to-1 return on investment compared to large corporations and companies making investments into their actual business here in the US, into property, plant, and equipment, research and development for new products and services. And until that gets fixed, where lobbying dollars are returning 100-to-1 return on investment compared to actually investing in new jobs, new products and services, growing businesses, which used to be what the stock market was for, raising capital. So when companies would raise capital and list their shares on the stock market, it used to be to build new factories here in the US for new products and services, for new property, plant, and equipment, to grow jobs, to grow businesses, to grow profits, to grow earnings, to grow free cash flow. And that benefited society and the companies until that changes with the corruption in DC and how things are distorted by fiat currency. And a lot of this corruption is because of fiat currency. Fiat currency and how easy the currency and credit is available to select groups, to large corporations, to insiders in DC, to hedge fund managers, to Wall Street banksters. Until this changes, and this got so much worse in 1971 and the decades that followed, and all the other loopholes that came about because of fiat currency, the corruption just took on orders of magnitude. And that's why you can get into the trillions now with waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. So if you want some more details about how bad things are in DC, take a look at the Best Government Money Can Buy documentary. It's really cheap now if you want to buy the DVD or if you just want to rent it, by Francis McGahey, Megahy. And I'll put a link to the documentary in the information and description section.